My hands clutch the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles are white, but I don't ease up. I just keep driving. Forward. Away. I left. After 20 years of pretending, of holding my breath, of swallowing my own misery to keep the peace, I finally left. The betrayal wasn't new. Maybe I always knew, deep down, that it would come to this. I felt it in the way he started staying out late, in the way he'd glance at his phone with that slight hesitation, in the coldness that crept into our home like a slow-moving poison. I waited for a breaking point, some final straw to justify walking away. But in the end, it wasn't some dramatic discovery that did it. It was me. The realization that I couldn't do this anymore. So I packed a suitcase, walked out of the house I had spent half my life in, and started driving. Now I'm here, parked outside my son's house. Adrian, my boy, my anchor, the only person I could think to turn to when my world collapsed. I glance up at the house, its porch light casting a warm glow against the dark sky. Through the rain-speckled glass, I can see a faint outline of movement inside. He's there. He's home. My heart pounds in my chest, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I should go inside. I should knock. Before I can gather the courage, the front door swings open. A tall figure steps onto the porch, silhouetted against the light. Adrian. He's 24 now, no longer the boy I kissed goodbye at college, but a man. His hair is damp and slightly disheveled, as if he just ran a hand through it. He's wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, the kind he used to sleep in as a teenager. His sharp blue eyes scan the driveway, and the second they land on me, they widen. I barely have time to react before he's moving. He sprints through the rain, ignoring the downpour drenching him, and yanks open my car door. Mom! His voice cracks, and then he pulls me into his arms. The second I feel his warmth, something inside me shatters. A sob tears from my throat, raw and aching, and I collapse against him. He holds me tight, arms wrapped around me like he's afraid I'll disappear again. And then, gently, desperately, he presses a kiss to my forehead. "For God's sake, Mom," he murmurs, his voice thick with emotion. "Where have you been?" I can't answer. My throat is too tight, my chest too heavy. I just bury my face against his shoulder, shaking. He doesn't rush me. He just holds me, one hand stroking my rain-damp hair, the other gripping the back of my coat. The rain pours down around us, but I don't feel the cold. Just him. After a long moment, he exhales sharply and pulls back just enough to look at me. His gaze searches my face, and I see it there. The worry, the relief, the 1,000 questions he's holding back. "Come inside," he says, his voice softer now. "You're freezing." I nod numbly, and he wraps an arm around me, guiding me up the steps. The house is warm. The scent of fresh coffee and something faintly citrusy lingers in the air. The TV hums softly in the background, playing some late-night show. It's cozy, lived in, safe. Adrian doesn't say anything as he takes my suitcase and sets it by the stairs. Instead, he leads me into the kitchen, pulls out a chair, and gestures for me to sit. I sink down, my limbs heavy. A moment later, a steaming mug is pressed into my hands. Tea. Not coffee. He remembers. I lift it to my lips, letting the heat seep into my frozen fingers. Across from me, Adrian sits down, his elbows resting on the table. He doesn't push, doesn't demand an explanation. He just watches me, waiting. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe. I'm safe. And for now, that's enough. Adrian moved around the kitchen with an ease that made it clear this space belonged to him. The years had changed him, reshaped him into someone stronger, more confident. At 32, he was no longer the boy I had raised, but a man who carried himself with the kind of steady presence I had always envied. He had his father's sharp jawline but none of his coldness. Where his father had been distant, Adrian was attentive. Where his father had been harsh, Adrian was gentle. I hadn't expected to break down so easily in his arms earlier, but the moment I saw him standing in the doorway, concern etched deep into his features, the dam had burst. Decades of exhaustion, of loneliness, of pretending I was fine. It had all come rushing out the second his arms wrapped around me. And he had held me, not with pity, not with empty reassurances, but with the quiet strength of someone who understood. Now, As he placed a plate of food in front of me, his movements slow and deliberate, I felt the weight of his presence anchoring me. I hadn't eaten since morning, but my stomach was a tangled knot, too full of emotion to make room for anything else. Still, I picked up the fork, more for his sake than my own, taking small bites just to ease the worry I knew he wouldn't voice aloud. The warmth of his hand brushed against mine briefly as he reached for his own cup, a fleeting touch that grounded me more than I cared to admit. It had been so long since someone had touched me with kindness, not out of obligation, not with ulterior motives, but simply because they cared. My husband's touch had become a distant memory long before I had the courage to leave. The rare moments he did reach for me had felt rehearsed, empty gestures meant to maintain appearances rather than to express affection. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath, but the memories came unbidden, weaving themselves into the present before I could push them away. The first time I suspected something was wrong, I had dismissed it. A forgotten anniversary, an unusual detachment, a growing disinterest in the details of my life. I had told myself that marriage was built on more than passion, that love changed over time, that perhaps I had been expecting too much. Then came the late nights, the inexplicable absences, the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his collar. The distance between us had stretched into something unbearable, yet I had clung to the belief that if I just tried harder, if I just loved him enough, he would find his way back to me. But love alone was never enough. The final betrayal hadn't come in the form of a dramatic confession or a tearful apology. It had come in the cold indifference in his eyes when I confronted him. The way he had looked at me, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with the detached irritation of a man who had already moved on. It was then that I realized I had been holding on to something that no longer existed. Perhaps it never had. The weight of it all settled heavily on my shoulders now, but as I opened my eyes, I found Adrian watching me, quiet understanding in his gaze. He didn't press me to speak, didn't demand an explanation. He simply reached over, fingers brushing lightly against my arm, a wordless reminder that I wasn't alone. A lump formed in my throat, but it wasn't just grief this time. It was something else, something lighter, something unfamiliar. When he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek, I felt it down to my very bones. The warmth of it, the silent reassurance, the quiet promise that I didn't have to do this alone. And then, with the same steady certainty that had always defined him, he let me know what I had been too afraid to ask for. This was my home now. Not just for tonight, not just for a brief escape, for as long as I needed. The tightness in my chest loosened just a little. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. For the first time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The morning light seeped through the curtains in delicate slivers, painting the room in soft, muted gold. It felt unfamiliar waking up somewhere new, in a bed that didn't carry the weight of restless nights and quiet grief. The sheets smelled clean, fresh, nothing like the ones back home, where the scent of betrayal and wasted years still clung no matter how many times I washed them. For a moment I just lay there listening. The house was quiet, but not in the hollow, suffocating way I had grown used to. There was movement beyond the door. The sound of water running, the faint rustle of pages turning, the occasional creak of floorboards. Adrian was awake. A part of me wanted to stay curled up under the blankets, to sink back into the temporary comfort of solitude. But another part, the part that had fought to leave, to start over, urged me forward. I pushed back the covers and sat up slowly, stretching my arms above my head. My body still felt heavy with exhaustion, not just from the past few days, but from years of holding myself together. The weight of it all pressed against my ribs, making it hard to take a full breath. Just as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the door creaked open. Adrian stood there, 2 mugs in his hands, steam rising in delicate tendrils from the dark liquid inside. He had always been thoughtful like that, even as a boy. When he was little, he would sit beside me in the mornings, handing me a cup of tea with small, chubby hands, insisting that it would make me feel better. He didn't say anything as he walked over, setting one of the mugs on my nightstand before handing me the other. Our fingers brushed, his warm against my cold, and he lingered just a second longer than necessary. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into my skin. The scent of coffee curled into the air, rich and familiar. Adrian didn't push me to talk. He just sat down beside me on the edge of the bed, his presence solid and steady. For a while, we just sat there, drinking in silence. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't alone with my thoughts. After a while, he shifted, setting his empty mug down before turning to me with quiet determination. He had taken time off work. He wanted to take me somewhere, to get away from the ghosts still lingering in the spaces I had left behind. At first, the thought of traveling seemed too overwhelming. I had spent so long simply trying to survive that the idea of stepping outside my routine, of letting myself experience something new, felt almost indulgent. But the way Adrian looked at me, the certainty in his gaze, the quiet understanding, made the decision for me. By midday, the car was packed. The sun was high, casting dappled light through the trees lining the driveway. Adrian moved effortlessly, loading the last of our bags into the trunk before turning back to me. There was something different in his expression, something lighter, a flicker of excitement, like the kind he used to have when he was younger, when road trips meant adventure instead of escape. The drive stretched long before us, winding through miles of open fields and sleepy towns. The road hummed beneath the tires, a rhythmic, soothing sound. The windows were down, letting in the crisp autumn air, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. For the first hour, I just watched the scenery blur past, my thoughts tangled in the past. The memories came in flashes, moments of quiet hurt, of ignored pleas, of nights spent lying awake beside a man who had long since stopped seeing me. But then, as the miles rolled by, something inside me started to shift. The further we got from the life I had left behind, the lighter my chest felt. At some point, Adrian reached across the center console, his hand settling over mine in a reassuring squeeze. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. I wasn't alone. The sun had begun its slow descent when we finally arrived at our destination. A quiet cabin, tucked away near a shimmering lake, surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The air smelled clean, untouched by the chaos I had come from. As I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff limbs, Adrian came up beside me. And then, without a word, he turned toward me, his expression unreadable. His hands found my shoulders first, warm and steady, before he leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my cheek. It wasn't rushed, wasn't fleeting. It was a reminder, a reassurance. His touch said everything he didn't need to say out loud. This is your home now. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe it. The sun had long dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the cabin in a gentle twilight glow. A cool breeze swept across the lake, carrying the smell of pine and earth, grounding me in this moment, in this peaceful place. The world seemed to slow down here, as though the worries and distractions that had once defined my life no longer had a hold over me. I was wrapped in a soft blanket, sitting on the porch with my legs tucked up beneath me. My eyes wandered across the lake, watching the way the water shifted with each passing breeze, as though it, too, was breathing, gentle and steady. The only sound was the quiet rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. I felt more alive here than I had in years, but at the same time, there was a quiet sadness tucked in the corners of my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. My past wasn't something I could easily forget, nor was it something I wanted to pretend hadn't shaped me. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't letting it define me. My son, Adrian, had gone inside to light a fire. The warmth of the flames would fill the cabin soon. But for now, the cold air was a comfort to me, refreshing, like a splash of cold water to a tired face. As I sat there, lost in the beauty of the moment, my phone vibrated softly on the table beside me. My stomach tightened instinctively, the feeling of dread sinking in almost immediately. I glanced at the screen, knowing who it was before I even looked. His name. I felt an icy wave wash over me, my body instantly becoming rigid, every muscle tense. The phone rang 3 times before Adrian's voice broke the silence. He had answered without hesitation, as if he already knew what was coming. I didn't have to hear him speak to understand the anger in his tone, the fire that flared inside him in defense of me. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but listen. I didn't need to hear the words on the other end. I already knew. I already knew the excuses he would make, the hollow apologies, the promises of change that meant nothing now. I had heard it all before. For years, I had heard the same words from the same man, each time a little emptier than the last. But Adrian, he wasn't going to let him get away with it. My heart swelled with pride in something else, something tender. Adrian had grown into a man who would stand up for me without question, without hesitation. The little boy I had raised, the one who had once needed me to protect him, had now become the protector. Adrian's voice was sharp and unwavering as he yelled into the phone. I could hear the desperation in his tone, the frustration. I could picture his face, set in a hard line, eyes flashing with an intensity that only came when he was fighting for something he cared about. I could almost hear my husband's voice crackling through the line, desperate and pleading, begging me to come back. But Adrian didn't let him finish. His words were cutting, like a blade of steel, telling him he had no right to ask for me, telling him I wasn't coming back, that after everything he had done, there was no place for him in my life. The words were sharp, but they were necessary, and in some way they gave me a sense of closure. When the call ended, the house fell into silence, a heavy kind of quiet. Adrian didn't speak immediately, his breathing slow, measured. I could sense the anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior, but as he walked toward me, that anger began to melt into something softer. He stood in front of me, looking down with eyes that were both intense and gentle, like he was silently asking if I was okay. Without a word, he knelt in front of me, his hands reaching up to touch my face. His fingers brushed softly across my cheek, like he was making sure I was real, making sure that I was still here with him. And then, without warning, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine in a soft, tentative kiss, like a question, unsure, but full of something deeper. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet moment where the past, the pain, the weight of everything that had come before, seemed to dissolve for just a second. But it wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a silent vow that, no matter what, I wasn't alone anymore. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm and steady against my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment, the connection between us. "I'm here," he whispered, though the words didn't need to be spoken. I could feel them in the way he held me, in the way his fingers lingered against my skin. But even in that moment, even with the warmth of his presence, a familiar chill gripped me, like a ghost from the past, lingering just beyond my reach. The phone rang again, pulling me from the embrace. This time I didn't need to check the screen. I knew exactly who it was. Adrian's eyes narrowed when he saw me hesitate, and before I could even reach for it, he picked up the phone himself. His expression was fierce, protective, as though he was ready to tear through any walls my husband had left standing. The conversation was brief. I didn't hear the words, but the tone was all I needed to understand. Adrian's voice was commanding, forceful. I could hear the anger and hurt in his words, feel the fire that burned in his chest. When he hung up, he looked at me, his eyes softening. Without a word, he stepped closer, cupping my face in his hands once more. This time, his kiss was deeper, more deliberate. I leaned into him, feeling the world slip away with the touch of his lips. This wasn't just a kiss. It was everything I had needed for years. In that one moment, all of the pain, the regret, the longing, it all disappeared. I wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned anymore. I wasn't just a mother or a wife. I was a person. I was whole. And I was loved. When we finally pulled apart, I could see the calm in Adrian's eyes, the way his chest rose and fell with steady breaths. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In this moment, there was only peace. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The drive back home felt different. The roads were familiar, but everything seemed new. I could feel a strange sense of calm settling inside me, but also something else, a lingering uncertainty, like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The weight of everything that had happened felt lighter now, but there was still that echo in my mind, a reminder of the life I had left behind. Adrian was beside me, as quiet as ever. His presence, though, was comforting in ways I couldn't quite put into words. The bond between us had always been strong, but now it felt as though something had shifted. It was as though the boundary between mother and son had blurred, or maybe I had simply let it. There was a tenderness in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before, not in this way. We had always been close, but now I felt as though I could almost see the man he was becoming, the protector, the one who would stand by me no matter what. He was no longer the boy who needed me to shield him. He had become my shield. It was a strange realization, knowing that your child has grown into someone who can take care of you, someone whose love is no longer that of a dependent, but of an equal. And I wondered, in that quiet moment, if this was how mothers felt when they realized their children no longer needed them in the same way. That, perhaps, they were no longer children, but adults in their own right. We arrived at the house, and as we stepped out of the car, the familiar sounds of home hit me. Birds chirping, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rustling of the trees. It all felt distant now, like I had been away for much longer than just a few days. But as I looked at the house, the place I once thought of as mine, I realized that it no longer felt the same. It was a place filled with too many memories, too many reminders of a life I couldn't return to. I turned to Adrian, his eyes steady and understanding. "I'm here," he said simply, but the way he said it made me feel like it was a promise. A promise that, no matter where I went or what happened, I wouldn't be alone. He took my hand gently, guiding me toward the door, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel afraid. Inside, the house seemed different. It wasn't the warm, familiar space I had once known. But as I stepped inside, Adrian followed me, his hand never leaving mine, as if offering me a strength I didn't have to ask for. There was a moment of silence before he stepped closer. His eyes held mine, a deep understanding passing between us, an unspoken bond. And then, without warning, he leaned in. His kiss was soft, yet it held a depth I hadn't expected. It wasn't just a kiss of affection. It was a kiss of reassurance, a kiss that told me everything would be okay. It was the kiss of someone who knew me, who understood the weight of my heart, the weight of my journey. And in that moment, the lines between mother and son seemed to vanish. The roles we had played for so many years, the roles I had clung to so tightly, seemed insignificant. We were simply two people who cared for each other in a way that transcended the typical boundaries of our relationship. I didn't know what the future would hold, but with Adrian by my side, I knew I was ready to face it. The kiss, the touch, the quiet understanding between us, they were enough to tell me that we could navigate whatever came next together. As we broke apart, his hand rested on my cheek, and I felt the warmth of his touch grounding me once again. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the closeness that seemed to fill the space between us. In that moment, I realized that the boundaries of motherhood had been redefined. It wasn't just about protecting or guiding. It was about standing beside each other, sharing the weight of life, and offering love in all its forms, no matter how it was expressed. The past was behind me, and whatever came next, I knew we'd face it as a team. A mother and son, yes, but also something more, something deeper. The kiss was the symbol of that bond, one that would endure no matter what.